Welcome to our online and in-person IAF audience. My name is Mike Leonard, and I'll be serving as your MC tonight. Tonight, we're going to tackle a difficult subject. Israel and Palestine were not on our schedule until recent events mandated that we address it. There was brief consideration whether the issues facing the Middle East were too recent, too raw, and too polarizing. We decided that if we were to be true to our mission to educate and inform our members, that we could not ignore the situation in favor of less controversial topics. Many of you came here tonight with your minds made up as to the rightness of your position. We respect that, but would ask you to reflect that there are others in the audience who feel equally passionate about their views and may not agree with you. I'm going to insist upon courtesy and respect for both our neighbors and the topic. Solutions, if they exist, will not be illuminated by trying to shout down the other side. There's always a danger, by the way, when Marine generals quote German philosophers, but I am going to do that. The German philosopher Friedrich Hegel defined a tragedy as when both sides are right or both sides are wrong. In this situation, both conditions are met. We are witnessing a tragedy for all concerned. Please take a moment to silence your cell phones. Our speakers will be taking questions at the end of the presentation, and if you have a question, please put it on cards that will be provided to you and pass it to one of our terrific volunteers. You can remain anonymous, or you can put your name on the card. If you are a student, we ask that you put student at the top of the card. We want to ensure that student voices are heard and their questions are heard. You are our future. If you're part of our virtual audience, you can send us your questions at any point in the presentation using the Zoom Q&A function. For regular IAF members, both of our speakers are well known to our audience. They have both held significant positions in our IAF leadership, and they have unique insight into the events leading up to the present Israel and Palestine conflict. And I would ask you to give them your full attention and consideration. Leila Hilal is currently the director of Detroit Workforce Funder Collaborative. She lived in the West Bank for nearly a decade. She recently returned from Jordan. Leila Hilal is an international human rights lawyer and peacebuilding practitioner. She was based in Ramallah for nearly a decade in the 2000s, during which time she served as a legal advisor to the Palestinian negotiation teams and then a policy advisor to the Commissioner General of the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees. She has also served as a senior advisor to the Carter Center's Conflict Resolution Program and directed policy programming on the Middle East at New America in Washington, D.C. She previously clerked at the Constitutional Court of South Africa. She currently advises global and U.S.-based private foundations and nonprofit organizations. She holds a JD from the State University of New York at Buffalo Law School and an LL.M from Harvard Law School. She is a member of the State Bar of New York. She served as the first staff director of IAF from 2019 to 2021, fostering its transition as a formal program into NMC. Jack Siegel is a retired senior U.S. diplomat who served at the U.S. Embassy in Israel as counselor for political military affairs during the First Intifada and the Gulf War. His wife, Karen, published a book on U.S.-Israeli strategic cooperation at Tel Aviv University. In 1993, they together created the first Western diplomatic outpost in central Russia. Jack also served at the NSC as director for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia, and later director for nonproliferation, and at NATO as senior political advisor to NATO's operational commander in Afghanistan. Both Jack and Leila will provide historical context for the present crisis. In the words of the writer Maya Angelou, if you cannot really know where you are going until you know where you've been, neither speaks for either the Palestinian or Israeli people, but hopefully both will provide valuable perspective. Jack will present first, followed by Leila. When they are done, we will begin taking questions from the audience and directing them to one or both of our speakers. If you wish to direct your question to a particular Speaker, write it on your question card. Thank you, and let us begin. Jack?
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This is, as Chairman Leonard just said, an incredibly difficult topic, and so I'm very happy that we're gathered here tonight. I hope we can have a civil exchange of views. We have a very difficult problem, and it can be summarized in one sentence. Two people, one territory, and two versions of the history. I'd like to make 5 basic points, by necessity very brief, because we're trying to keep these opening remarks short so that you have plenty of time to pose your questions and we have a discussion. Given the thousands of books that have been written on Israel and Palestine, presenting just 5 points is obviously arbitrary. Maybe it's crazy, but here goes. 1, the view from Israel is that things have irrevocably changed since the Hamas attack on October 7th. Israeli Jews were shocked and disgusted by the depravity of the attackers in the catastrophic events perpetrated by Hamas on October 7. 1,200 Israeli killed and 240 taken hostage in one day. If this had happened in America, that would equate to a terrorist raid from Mexico into San Diego, in which 40,000 Americans were killed and thousands were taken hostage. How would we react? Hamas continues to attack Israel, and just yesterday they fired 120 missiles out of the safe zone where the Palestinians were told to go. 120 missiles were fired out of there into Israel. Israeli citizens not just Israel, but many other governments, including Arab governments, see Hamas as a dangerous influence in the Middle East. From the Israeli perspective, backed up by many military analysts here in the U.S., the threat from Hamas must be eliminated for there to be any possibility for peace in the region. The terrible question today is, at what price can Hamas be eliminated? How many Gazan casualties is acceptable? Hamas is purposely embedded in civilian life to make this price as high as possible. This is at the heart of the current debate over a possible ceasefire. The second point I would make is Israel is united now because of the attack. But like many countries, Israel has always been deeply divided along right and left politics. It wasn't long ago that tens of thousands of Israelis were out on the streets protesting plans by Bibi Netanyahu and his right-wing government to reduce the power of their judiciary. At its heart, Bibi's right-wing government over the past years has been trying to destroy the possibility of the much-desired two-state solution. Indeed, in 2015, Bibi said, "There will never be a two-state solution if I'm prime minister." Now, how has he been making it so difficult to have a two-state solution? First, by secretly strengthening Hamas. He has communicated to Qatar, who is the financial backer of Hamas, that they should send more funds to Hamas and that he will turn his eye if some of that money is diverted to Hamas's military wing. By weakening the Palestinian Authority, this Palestinian Authority, the PA was supposed to control all of the West Bank and Gaza, but now controls only a fraction of the West Bank and none of Gaza. Third step for Bibi was turning loose the settlers in the West Bank. There are now, the number is disputed, but there's something about 500,000 or 600,000 settlers in the West Bank living there, and he is allowing them and encouraging them to purchase weapons and turning a blind eye to their harassment and violence against the Arabs who live in the West Bank. And he provides IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, protection to those settlers. The goal is, from as far as we can understand it, of making the West Bank untenable as a place that would be part of this two-state solution, where we have a mix of violent settlers and Palestinians. The Israelis are demanding explanations for the total failure of their security apparatus. They are angry at Netanyahu and his secret plan to split the Palestinians from the Palestinian Authority by surreptitiously strengthening Hamas. Israelis are fearful of Hamas's threats of further attacks, and they are livid that the hostages that are still being held are being abandoned. The third point I want to make is Hamas also rules out a two-state solution. In fact, they call for the end of a Jewish state. Now, what happens after October 7th, and that means now? Hamas has revived the dream of liberation of all of Palestine under Hamas's rule, an end to Israeli occupation all over the historic land of Palestine, an end to Israeli dominance of the region, and an end to a Jewish state. Hamas sees the Gaza operation as a great victory. 200,000 Israelis right now have been evacuated from northern towns and kibbutzes along the Gaza border. Hamas has usurped the Palestinian Authority's role as the sole representative of Palestinian aspirations and is working on expanding its role in the West Bank. From Israel's perspective, it cannot countenance nor negotiate with an entity that calls for its total destruction. Egypt's Sadat was the first Arab government to accept Israel's right to exist, and a peace treaty followed. The more recent progress on the Abraham Accords under the Trump administration, and progress being made in recent weeks with Saudi Arabia to bring them into these accords, was a very dangerous move from the standpoint of Hamas and from many other Palestinians. It means marginalizing the Palestinian issue and focusing instead on the interstate relationships. Now, fourth, some of you may be wondering or may not know, why does Israel even exist? The simple answer for why Israel exists is the Holocaust, the extermination of 6 million Jews during the Second World War from 1941 to 1945. As survivors of the Nazi death camps were pushed into makeshift temporary camps, they were called, including in Cyprus, you might have seen or read the book Exodus, they continued to be denied entry to the U.S., to Britain, and yes, to Palestine. They were unwelcome in Poland, Russia, and other Eastern European states from which they had been deported by the Nazis. Meanwhile, the British were trying to get out from under the mandate that they had been given by the League of Nations back in the 1920s. And they published something called the Balfour Declaration. I'm condensing so much history here, but in 1947, the newly formed United Nations passed its partition plan for Palestine. The Balfour Declaration provided that there would be a home for the Jews in Palestine, so long as the rights of existing populations in Palestine were not violated. Then, secretly, the British told Chaim Weizmann, who was the head of the Jewish Agency at that moment, that actually this meant there would be a Jewish state in Palestine. Getting out from under this mandate, the British agreed to leave Palestine, and the United Nations, a brand new organization at the time, came up with a partition plan in which the Jews would get part of historic Palestine and the Arabs would get part of it. Israel accepted the plan. At the time, the Jews were about 32% of the population of Palestine, and they were allocated 56% of the territory, much of it in the Negev desert. They accepted it. The Arabs rejected the plan, arguing that all Palestine should go to the Arabs, and Jews could continue to live in a unified Arab-led state. Please keep in mind that the Mufti of Jerusalem collaborated with the Nazis throughout World War II and after. The result of the partition plan, really, after a 6-month battle in Palestine, was a full-fledged war in which all the Arab states surrounding Israel attacked. The Israelis had been prepared for this and were cognizant of the danger, and they did manage to repel that attack. The termination of the mandate on May 15th, 1948, 75 years ago, was coincidental with the independence declaration by the Jews in Israel and the creation of a Jewish state of Israel, a Jewish state. Now that leads to many problems in the future, but my last point is this. Israeli Jews feel they have no safe place to go. Israel is the only safe haven for Jews in the world, which is why the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, trains their soldiers never to retreat. They ask them, where would you retreat to? When do they come to your family? And they think about that attack that occurred on October 7th, where families were slaughtered. Most Jews living far from the conflict support Israel. As anti-Semitism continues to grow, even Jews here in America and around the world would support Israel as their only safe haven. You may be surprised or shocked to know that conversations are happening in Jewish congregations here in America of where Jews would be safe if anti-Semitism takes over in the United States. Echoes of Nazi Germany, which has left permanent generational trauma. So Israeli Jews view any outcome that leaves Hamas on Israel's 1967 borders as an unacceptable danger that would bring constant war and terrorism. Israeli Jews won't accept it. Even the most liberal cannot live with constant rocket barrages and murderous raids. Hamas has become Israel's greatest threat, despite having been seen as recently as early October by Israeli intelligence as being unable to attack Israel in any serious way. I'd love to see the peace process with the Palestinians restarted, but peace with Hamas is unthinkable now. And as violence begets more violence and extremism, it's more and more difficult to imagine who will be sitting down at that table. That's my time limit. Let me turn over to Leila Hilal. Thank you.
Hello, and I want to thank Aya for the invitation, and it's great to be back here and to see old friends and new faces. I've heard all of the admonitions about civility, and it's sort of a little depressing to me that we have to caveat discussions of immense consequence with those brackets. But anyway, I look forward in particular to the Q&A. My comments are intended to set up some context and trace a bit about what's happened in the past 2 months, and to reflect a little bit at the end about what I think are important principles for thinking about a future peace. So I begin by sharing with you that when I was invited to speak here, of course, very excited and happy that this hotspot was being planned to take up an important issue of consequence for all of us and for the Palestinians and the Israelis, etc. I was not asked to speak to a specific issue or topic within this conflict terrain. And so I was thinking about what would be constructive and most urgent to talk about in here tonight. What on this stage in Traverse City at this moment do we need to think about? And as I was invited in mid-October, and as October turned to November, turned to December, my thinking about what is really important and urgent has evolved. In the beginning, in October, 2 weeks after the attack, Hamas attack on Israelis, and then the Israeli response of bombing and other elements, which I'll speak to a little bit later. I was thinking that really what is most important to talk about tonight is context, to talk about the facts, because the conflict did not begin on October 7th, and Hamas's attack did not occur in a vacuum. Its scale was unprecedented, but that it happened was not necessarily surprising. It was not the first act of violence, violent resistance committed by Palestinians, and it was not the first time Israeli citizens or interests have been acted upon. So we cannot look at October 7th as in the abstract. It has a long continuum of history prior, and we are in for a very long, tumultuous time in the days ahead. I know that people here, very few, have probably visited the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, or Palestinian communities in Israel. To the extent that people here have visited Israel, it's probably in the context of going to the cosmopolitan city of Tel Aviv or touring religious sites in Jerusalem and perhaps looking at the beautiful views from the north and at the hills of Tabariya. But because the US is really a direct actor in this war, because our nation has sizable Arab and Palestinian and Jewish citizenry, because staunch Israeli supporters wield significant power in the US, and because Palestinian solidarity movements are growing in visibility and intersecting with movements like Black Lives Matter, we are compelled to learn, unpack, and hopefully act. Israel was not living peaceably when Hamas unleashed its attack on October 7th. Yes, the majority of Israeli citizens did not have to deal with or even see the daily oppression that Palestinians were and are living under, but the Israeli government and military was enforcing a regime of apartheid and occupation in the Palestinian territories, far from the view of the average Israeli citizen. Analysts have long been predicting a Palestinian explosion. Think, the Gaza Strip is not a state. It's a small strip of densely populated land, effectively occupied by Israel still. Israel has maintained a 17-year blockade on the territory and the people living there by land, air, and sea. On October 7th, people in Gaza were already living in a humanitarian of immense proportions due to the blockade. In 2012, the UN issued a report that Gaza would be uninhabitable by 2020, with one of the main issues being the lack of access to potable water, as well as the inability to grow and develop and have a vibrant economy because of conditions of blockade. Palestinians living in Gaza and the West Bank are stateless. More than 70% of Gaza's residents originate from places inside Israel. Some families in Gaza are within kilometers of their former and ancestral homes and land inside Israel, including in some of the kibbutzim that were attacked on the 7th. Israel has never allowed Palestinians to return. Their properties were expropriated and made available for Jewish settlement. When Israel occupied territory in 1967, that's the West Bank and Gaza, it continued to appropriate Palestinian land, particularly in the West Bank, and expropriation was for continued Jewish settlement. While Israel withdrew its settler population in Gaza around 2005 under the disengagement plan under Sharon, it maintained the blockade of severe control. It also adopted a policy of separation, attempting to separate Jewish Israelis from Palestinians in the occupied territories. Because for Jewish Israelis, what they do not see means they do not have to deal with. In the West Bank, Israel expanded its settlement enterprise, and Jack mentioned the significant cost that that has played to the ability to reach a solution. More than 700 to 800,000 Israeli citizens live in settlements across the West Bank alone. Palestinians are contained within designated areas in the West Bank. They're contained by an administrative permit regime that Israel controls. There are fortified checkpoints, and there is a very large concrete wall snaking through the West Bank, separating families, communities, and keeping Palestinians within certain areas. And in the areas where Jewish settlers live, they have free reign. So there is a dual system of rights and mobility and other aspects of life pertaining to Jewish Israelis that live in the West Bank and Palestinians. And this is true of Gaza. People in Gaza, living in Gaza, are also subject to harsh conditions of blockade. In Israel, you have 20% of Israeli citizens are Palestinian citizens of Israel. They are also subject to a discriminatory regime which treats their status as secondary to Jewish citizens of Israel. This is the reality of apartheid, and it's been deepening and increasing across Israel. It has led organizations like Human Rights Watch to declare the regime of apartheid in Israel. All of this happened before October 7th. While this was happening, there was a growing constituency amongst Israeli Jews to also recognize that there is a regime of apartheid, that the occupation has been going on too long, that Israel is not able to maintain its security and its humanity while maintaining this system of apartheid and ongoing settler colonialism. These developments were also then matched by a growing extremism within Israel, where Jewish national settlers began building their power alongside Netanyahu and increasing their extremist policies, including actual violence against Palestinians. So you have all of these trends of escalating conflict leading up to October 7th. For me, I wanted to share some of these historical facts and some of this political context so that we can have, in addition to Jack's comments, a full discussion and hopefully turn towards questions of how can we address the situation to build and move towards peace. But for me, as October bled into November and the bombing of Gaza did not stop, the aid did not flow, I became very concerned that we are facing a situation of extreme genocide. Yes, Israel claims it is acting in self-defense against a terrorist movement that brutally attacked and captured its citizens. And yes, to a degree, we can call it a war. But because of the occupation and because of the regime of apartheid, Israel has other motivations at hand. The duration and scale of what is happening today in Gaza and in the West Bank underscores these motivations. Israel's campaign of genocide against the Palestinian civilian population has resulted in more than 18,000 deaths of Palestinians. 70% of the deaths are children. Thousands have been maimed. Cultural and social infrastructure has been destroyed. Entire residential blocks have been destroyed in single bombings as well. And high-level Israeli officials have stated their genocidal intent. On October 10th, the IDF spokesperson said that the emphasis is on damage, not accuracy. On the same day, Israeli Defense Minister Gallant said, "I have lowered restraints. We will kill everyone we fight against. We will use every means necessary." Israel is also systematically denying Palestinians basic survival necessities. The Defense Minister Gallant stated on 9 October, "I have ordered a complete siege of Gaza. There will be no electricity, no food, no fuel. Everything is closed. We are fighting human animals, and we are acting accordingly." Today, the UN says 50% of Gaza's population is starving. Israel's agricultural minister said, "We are rolling out the Gaza Nakba." Nakba is catastrophe for the Palestinians, representing their original displacement in 1948. The intention to exterminate Palestinians has not been limited to Gaza. In the West Bank, there's been a proliferation of arming of settlers who have been assassinating Palestinians, men, women, and children. The IDF is backing and not stopping these settlers, individuals, civilians from killing Palestinians. There has also been significant increase in arrests and razing of Palestinian infrastructure in Gaza. More than 5,000 Palestinians have been taken captive from the West Bank by the IDF since October 7th. This really is an escalation of 100 years of ethnic cleansing and a situation of apartheid. For me, then, take all of this and start to understand that we move into December looking at the role of the Biden administration with a lot of clarity. The United States is directly facilitating the genocide. This can no longer be sidestepped. One Israeli general, Yitzhak Brick, underscored the point. All of our missiles, the ammunition, the precision-guided bombs, all the airplanes and bombs, it's all the US. The minute they turn off the tap, you can't keep fighting. With its $3.8 billion in military grants to Israel annually, the US has been equipping Israel since 1974, and the state of Israel has substantial military infrastructure. But it doesn't have the ability to manufacture ammunition at the rate it is using it. Biden's sidestepping of Congress on December 9th, expediting 14,000 tank shells to Israel to continue this genocide against the Palestinian people, facing the number of 18,000 killed, seeing the destruction of residential areas, seeing the starvation of Palestinians is really, really shocking. But in addition, Israel is preventing the international community from acting in favor of a ceasefire. The United States was the single country to veto the recent resolution calling for a ceasefire. It also was one of only 10 countries voting against a ceasefire in the General Assembly. There were 153 countries at that vote in the General Assembly yesterday, 153 countries calling for a ceasefire. The US says no. We know from the polls of the American public that the American public does not agree with what the Biden administration is doing. We know from the actions of State Department dissenters, from congressional interns, from Biden staffers, various groups have demonstrated their dissent to these policies. We know that we are not in the majority when Biden stands up and says, we will do anything to defend Israel's security, even if it means the extermination of a people. This is a problem. How are we going to get over this? The notion that the next step is that the guns stop, the bombs stop, and we rebuild Gaza is quite remarkable to me. Today, Gazans are being pushed into a very small strip of barren land. Their homes, 1.8 million, have been left homeless. The infrastructure is destroyed. Cultural, educational, hospitals, the healthcare sector has been in ruins. How do you propose to rebuild from that? And how do you propose to rebuild when you have so many children and people with amputated legs and having gone through the experience of trying to be exterminated? I think the situation is quite despairing, and we need to look at this reality. I want to just say a few words about what sorts of principles do we need to start thinking about if we are to think about returning or moving towards a situation that is more peaceable, that grants Palestinians the rights that they are denied right now, that protects everyone's security, but not through a process of elevating one people over another. I think one of the first things is that we must let Palestinians decide their own future. The US cannot engineer a new Palestinian leadership. It cannot engineer the PA as the next governor of the Gaza Strip. It's not a credible approach, but it's also not right. The Palestinian people need to be able to define their future. This is a challenge, and I hope we can discuss it more later. Secondly, any future peace needs to address the root causes of the conflict, and this is now the reality of apartheid. And underscoring this reality of apartheid is the notion that Israeli Jews have supremacy over Palestinians or others. We need to acknowledge the wrongs that have been committed and the racism that continues to drive these wrongs. And we must build coalitions and constituencies for peace within the Jewish American public, within Jewish Israelis, and within Palestinians. We must see Palestinians as an entire people, not just those that live in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, but also Palestinian citizens of Israel and the refugees. The right of return is fundamental to underscoring that there is a recognition of these principles. How do we get there from now to what is a long-term prospect? I think the US needs to call for a permanent ceasefire. We need to end aid to Israel, and we need to demand a complete end of occupation within the 1967 lines and allow for the freedom of movement for Palestinians. Then we can begin to negotiate along the principles I just mentioned. With constituencies for peace, with coalitions for peace, we are in a better place to make this happen. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Jack and Leila. I appreciate both of you taking on this actually tragic subject. We're going to start with the questions, and that's the time for our audience to get involved. I'm going to alternate questions from the auditorium and our online audience. And as we described earlier, if you have a question and it is written down on the card provided, get it to one of our helpers and we will read the questions from the podium. And if you desire, put your name on the podium, on the card if you wish to be identified. And we've got a couple of questions that came in already. The first one is from a student, Traverse City Central. And this is for both Jack and Leila. I'll let you all decide who wants to go first. And this, it goes like this. Israel's stated objective is to defeat Hamas. Is that possible? Won't excessive non-combatant casualties simply create a Hamas 2.0 in the future?
Is it possible to defeat Hamas? I think it is. I think the Israeli public demands it, and I'm speaking really about the Jewish Israeli public, the 80% who occupy the 1967 war. I should put that up here for a minute. So if I could ask for the slide of the 1967 war. Israel has been in several major wars, but the 1967 war, you see on the left, the before, which is the green part is 1967 borders of Israel. Israel was attacked by all of its Arab neighbors, not immediately by Jordan, but shortly thereafter. And Israel fought those Arab countries and defeated them. And in the defeat, they took control of the Sinai Peninsula, which is the one next to Egypt, the Gaza Strip, which had been Egyptian territory, the West Bank, which had been Jordanian controlled for quite a long time, both before and after the '67 war, and the Golan Heights, so that Israel now was the occupying power of these locations. The Israelis developed a very powerful military, as Leila mentioned. We give Israel $3.2 billion a year, and we give Egypt an equivalent amount each year as one of the conditions of the peace treaty that was negotiated by President Carter that resulted in the return of the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt. And in return, Egypt recognized Israel's right to exist. Now, you're asking, is it possible to defeat Hamas? Hamas is not a country. Hamas is a terrorist group, according to the United States, the European Union, Britain, and numerous other countries. And it has declared itself not looking for a peace treaty. It has declared itself looking for the elimination of the Jewish state. Now, if you were a Jew living in Israel, you would not be particularly interested in negotiating with Hamas. So the plan has been to defeat Hamas and to destroy it, to eliminate it as a force. And this has been accomplished to a degree against ISIS and against Al-Qaeda. But these are bloody battles that we're talking about. To take Fallujah took 2 years and tens of thousands of casualties, and the city of Fallujah barely exists today. That's the destruction of modern warfare. And that's what has happened in Gaza, and I don't defend the bombing campaign. I think it could have been done much more skillfully, let's say. But it is still going on, and as I mentioned in my presentation, even yesterday, 120 rockets are fired by Hamas out of the safe zone that has been created for Palestinians to go in the south. Those rockets came from somewhere. They came either from the tunnel system, and Hamas has 600 miles of tunnels under Gaza. I haven't been to Gaza in quite a while. I visited Gaza once a month from 1988 to 1991. It was not nearly as crowded. It was probably 1.2 million, not 2.2 million people. It was you have to say, you know, people always say it's one of the most densely populated places in the world. Well, it's exactly the size, almost exactly the size of the city of Philadelphia, where I grew up. I did not think I lived in one of the most densely populated places in the world, in Philadelphia. So there is a bit of an exaggeration going on. There are some large cities in Gaza, and there are refugee camps which certainly are overpopulated, and wildly so. And I visited those refugee camps back in that day a long time ago, and we had rocks thrown at us. I was with the IDF. And the IDF soldiers were coming to me, representing the United States, and saying, we shouldn't be doing this. We should not be occupying this place. The problem is that Hamas took over Gaza in 2007. They defeated the Palestinian Authority in an election, and then there was a rather bloody battle that went on for 3 weeks. And at the end of it, Hamas had control. And they did not take control in order to administer this territory as if they were good administrators. They were there to create a base where they could train an army to attack Israel. That is a situation that Israel cannot tolerate, and that's a situation that the United States agrees the Israelis should not be required to tolerate. What tragedy has gone on in Gaza since then, I think is a tragedy, and it needs to be explained, it needs to be understood, and it needs to stop, I agree. But a ceasefire is not the way to stop it. Both Israel and the United States have have in their possession intelligence, and this is information I got in the last week, that Hamas has a plan during the next ceasefire to move all of their people around through the tunnels. That they have a plan, in other words, to redeploy during the pause or the ceasefire. So Israel said, we can't accept that we can't create the opportunity for Hamas to redeploy. We think we know where they are now, and we are in the process of destroying them. So is it going to be successful in destroying Hamas? Maybe not. Maybe Hamas is an idea as much as it is an organization. But I do think that can kill all the leaders, and that may take years.
If we can give Leila a chance to also answer the question, and then we'll move on to the next one.
There are two versions to every history. Go ahead.
Well, can Hamas be defeated?
I just, instead of taking, for me, this notion of can Israel eliminate Hamas is somewhat offensive, because what is it doing? What's happening in Gaza? What is the destruction? It's of the civilian population. And so for me, I can't wrap my head around it logically. Is that what Israel is trying to do? I think it's trying to eliminate Palestinians in general. But I want to use this as a moment to talk a little bit about what is Hamas. And I wanted to show the map there's 4 images which show the historic compromise. Yeah, this one. So you will see here that that's historic mandate, historic Palestine. And 6% of the population before 1948, or before even maybe 1936, when significant Jewish immigration came, 6% of the population was Jewish. Palestinians, 2/3 of Palestinian nation were displaced from historic Palestine. 750 were made refugees, and their land was taken and given away, let's say, right? So then we have here what is the 1967 armistice lines. So many of the Palestinians who fled their homes in what is now Israel ended up in Gaza and the West Bank. That was a situation of occupation, whereby the PLO continued to insist on the right of return for the refugees, and to reclaim self-determination in all of historic Palestine. The PLO continued to make these claims through resistance, including, on occasion, violent resistance. The PLO decided in the 1980s to make a historic compromise, to accept that a Palestinian state would be established on 22% of their historic country in the West Bank and Gaza, relinquishing 78% and their ancestral homes and territory to the Israeli state. What happened? Did Israel agree to did Israel accept that compromise? Did the compromise usher in a two-state solution? No. What happened is Hamas looked at the situation. It was mostly an Islamic social welfare organization. It looked at the historic compromise. It looked at the weakness of the Palestinians. It looked at the fact that that the compromise wasn't leading to liberation. And they decided to become a resistance movement. And that is their ideology, resistance. Now, its tactics are abhorrent. We've seen the suicide bombings in Israel. We've seen the events of October 7th. We've seen the rockets being fired at civilians. The means are not acceptable. But what is Hamas? Hamas is about resistance. And right now, it's very hard to imagine that Palestinians do not want to resist the oppression, the apartheid that they face, that their existence is under threat. Do we not accept the notion that people can resist their oppression? If you have any empathy towards that idea, you might be able to say, well, yes, we can kill Hamas fighters, but you can't really kill the ideology of resistance.
I'm going to stop you right there because the next question I'm going to ask is going to feed into this particular one. It's from Gary, I think it's Appel. It says, I've been to Israel 4 times in Gaza and the West Bank, plus the refugee camps, Ramallah. Over and over, both Israelis and Palestinians would say the same thing. And this is the quote, the extremists are one another's best friends. Question, is there any middle anymore? I'll let either one of you take it first, but go ahead.
I mean, there is. We're seeing it now, quite frankly. Civil society is highly mobilized. Look at Jewish Voice for Peace. Look at Palestinian boycott, sanctions, divestment movement, nonviolent resistance and attempts to change the status quo. Look at Israeli human rights organizations like B'Tselem, Peace Now, Hamoked, Breaking the Silence. There is a middle ground. It is not going to be found in the US halls of power. It's not going to be found in the Israeli official circles, but it is going to be, the middle ground is with civil society, and it's civil society that is trying to work out questions of how do Israeli Jews and Palestinians live together in the future.
Jack?
I think there is the bare light at the end of the tunnel of moderation in both communities. But the left in Israel has been pushed further and further into irrelevance by the increasing strength of the right, who simply say we cannot live side by side because they are constantly attacking us. When Hamas was created, the second intifada started, and that second intifada was characterized by suicide bombings on buses, at marketplaces in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, and these were not sort of unusual events. The Israeli public felt that they were under attack constantly. And they had some reason to just feel that way because of the damage that was being done by Hamas. And I would say this is damage that Hamas was doing to the Palestinian Authority and to Yasser Arafat's PLO as well. Because Arafat did recognize, not directly, but he did recognize Israel's right to exist. And he moved into Gaza initially. Arafat himself was there. It was a big celebration in Gaza, as this was the first step towards a Palestinian state. That fell apart when Hamas took over, and Hamas became a terrorist organization with a land base in Israel, effectively, on the border of Israel. And we saw on October 7th, but we saw long before that Hamas's whole purpose has nothing to do with finding an accommodation with these Jews. It has to do with getting rid of the Jews. Now this has, Leila mentioned several words that are emotionally charged, but apartheid being one of them. But Israel will, if you pressure Israel into a corner, they will say, yes, it has to be a Jewish state. That was the purpose of Israel being created in 1948. And if it has to be a Jewish state, it can't be a democratic state. Unless you put the Arabs who are living in the West Bank and Gaza in a separate category. And in fact, the 2 million Arabs who live in Israel, the Palestinians who are Israeli citizens, they vote. They have members in the parliament. They have representation. They are not first-class citizens. I totally agree with that. But they do not live in a dictatorship. And what Hamas has in mind is a dictatorship of Hamas. It's not even the Palestinians. And I think it's important to differentiate the terrorists, the Hamas group, from the Palestinian people. The Palestinian people, I'll bet you 80% of them would wish that everybody would go away. And they could just live in peace in the normal way that they've lived for centuries. But that's not possible anymore. 1948 changed everything. 1967 changed the negotiation situation. And October 7th changed the situation with regard to dealing with the Palestinians.
Okay. Since October 7th, Hamas' popularity within Gaza has tripled. If they survive, will they achieve their objective?
I want to take on this notion that Hamas wants to destroy the state of Israel and all Jewish people. And around the time that Hamas was democratically elected, it revised its charter. First of all, it sought reconciliation with the PA. It had won elections, and it was up for governing as part of the Palestinian Authority, which the Palestinian Authority is the administrative regime created by the Oslo Accords, and the PA doesn't have an army, it doesn't have security control. Israel holds those aspects, but it has the ability to provide education and policing to an extent, and healthcare, et cetera. It's an administrative body. And so Hamas won the election because people were dissatisfied with the ruling Fatah party of the PA, because there was no progress on negotiations around the two-state solution. And when Hamas won, they sought reconciliation with the Fatah party by saying that they will accept a negotiated solution of two states along the 1967 lines. However, they wanted to put that any agreement between the Palestinians and Israeli to a referendum by the Palestinian people. They also revised their internal charter, saying that they recognize the validity of the 1967 lines as being the area within which the Palestinians would exercise their self-determination. They did not recognize Israel. They withheld recognition of Israel in that revision, but they did so because they did not want to give recognition until they got something from Israel back, recognition of historical wrongs, recognition of the Palestinian right to self-determination, until withdrawal and end of occupation. So it is actually a misnomer to say that Hamas wants the destruction of Israel. It is not a misnomer to say that the occupation over the Gaza Strip and the West Bank is extremely suffocating and extremely harmful. And it's also not a misnomer to say that Hamas's firing of rockets and violence has not gotten attention from the Israeli government, and particularly Netanyahu. So this, Hamas has accepted as principle the notion of two states. And it engages in some of this violence in a way because it sees it as the way to get a response, to create engagement with the Israeli state. And Hamas's main objective on October 7th was to take hostages because it's been able to negotiate the release of Palestinians held in Israeli detention centers through negotiation of hostage release. So we need to think carefully about what Hamas is, what they have accepted as compromise, and how nonviolence gets Palestinians nowhere, while violence seems to generate a response. I'm not endorsing it. I'm not endorsing it, but...
I'm sorry, they're negotiating with whom?
Negotiating with Netanyahu. It is not a direct sit-down discussion negotiation, but if Hamas sends in rocket fire, and Israel conducts reprisals, Hillary Clinton deploys to Egypt, and there are negotiations to create some resolution with some gain for opening up the border crossings and increase in aid or something like that. Violence has been a tactic through which...
But you can't be arguing that violence is good then.
No, but I'm not.
You have to go back to this revision of the Hamas charter because I can't read their minds about what they intended. What I've seen in the charter does not say there'll be a Jewish state of Israel.
No.
That will not happen. There'll be a Hamas-led Arab state of Israel, which they say they will allow Jews to live there under certain circumstances. That is not...
no, they said Palestinians would exercise their right to self-determination within the 1967...
And they would outnumber the Jews, and therefore the Jews...
In the 1967 line. I mean, perhaps we should not get in...
Yeah, we're not going to do a debate tonight. We promised we weren't going to do that. But I am going to try to move the last question, which we are going to have to get to. And I'll tell you what, I've got enough questions here that we ought to pass all of them on to the State Department for resolution. But the last one, I think, because I really want to try to get us moving forward. You know, we've talked a lot about Hamas, and possibly we should have talked more about the Palestinians as a whole, but, you know, that's just something that's almost unavoidable given the situation we have here today. But I'd like, this last question here is this, and it's for both of you, and it's, can obsession with the past limit options for the future? And as an explanation, you know, we've got Northern Ireland, which was fought over for centuries, individuals with different religions, different cultures, different countries, and yet there was finally leadership evolved that provided, while it's not a perfect place in Northern Ireland, it's much different than most of us of a certain age remember in the 50s and the 60s. So the question is that a model, and are there options for the future?
Shall I start? Northern Ireland is often cited as a model, and George Mitchell was in this area a couple of years ago, and we went to see what he had to say. He was the mediator, if you will. It really violates something that Leila said, which is that the Palestinians have to decide how their country will be structured. An outside arbitrator or an outside negotiator might have been useful, and for 20 plus years we had something called the peace process, and we negotiated. The United States took the lead on that, and we negotiated with the Arab states. We eventually negotiated directly with the Palestinians through the PLO, and I don't see that Hamas can play that role, and Hamas is not going to turn over its gains to the Palestinian Authority. Hamas feels strong right now that they have brought world's attention to the people of Gaza, and they deserve attention, and they should have benefited from the billions of dollars that were sent to Gaza by Qatar and by other countries and by international organizations. But instead, what they spent that money on was building a war machine. They built tunnels, they built rockets, they purchased rockets or were given rockets by Iran. This is not an organization that we can be negotiating with. And that's the feeling of the United States government. I certainly agree with it. And it's the feeling of the Jews in Israel. They can't negotiate. Let's say you came up with a solution that had the West Bank and Gaza under Hamas. Now, Hamas has been firing rockets for years into civilian communities in Israel, and more lately, they've been attacking directly. If that's what you want on the West Bank, where you're 1 mile away from large Israeli cities, that's what you'll get from Hamas. That's the feeling of the Jews in Israel today. They just can't accept Hamas having any role in the future of a solution. Now, if that's your going-in position, maybe you can negotiate that. But I think it's going to be a very difficult thing to negotiate.
Leila?
Sure. So I think, and many people think, I mean, the political atmosphere has changed significantly since, I mean, it's been changing, quite frankly, for the past several years. But I think we are increasingly of the opinion, those of us who are engaged in work around building a platform for negotiations, there's an increasing recognition that the two-state solution papered over the root causes of the conflict, namely dispossession and ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in order to create an exclusive Jewish state. This is continuing into the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip, and Gaza in the most horrific ways. If we are to address the root causes, we have to take on this question of Jewish supremacy. We need to understand that the legal regime in Israel is geared toward privileging Jewish persons and suppressing Palestinians. This is inequality, this is apartheid, and apartheid is a crime under international law. And we know from October 7th that it doesn't bring security to Israeli Jews. We know that. And we know that if we are going to really address the root causes and get to peace, that we have to address this question. I don't have the answers, but it's part of what we have to talk about. And what the Palestinians have to talk about and think about is recognizing Jewish sacred ties to the land. Now, I've been in many Track 2 sessions with Israelis who talk about, who recognize the Nakba, who recognize that Israeli actions led to the forcible displacement and death of Palestinians in 1948, which continues until today. They recognize the situation of apartheid. But what they ask for is recognition that they will be able to stay in the land. Now, this is a corner of conversation that I have been privy to. But if we're going to take on the question of Jewish supremacy and racism and dismantling the systems that enable that oppression and violence against Palestinians, Palestinians likewise have to take on the fact that Jewish Israelis have entitlements, have rights, have a place in the future of the country. Both peoples deserve security, and both peoples deserve a future that is based in acknowledging the other. I think I'll say one more thing, which is that many people will sit there and say, you think that Israel's not going to be a majority Jewish state? That will never happen. But we see apartheid in South Africa, where you had white supremacy over black citizens. That system was never going to change. The US backed apartheid for many years, but that system was dismantled. Jim Crow in the United States, that system of privileging whites and suppressing blacks, that system changed. We know we cannot maintain these systems of oppression and provide security and peace and stability, which is at great risk in the region. And the US reputation right now is also at great risk. So we cannot just say that will never happen, that's unrealistic. We have to take on these hard questions. And at the center of them is in my view, and in the view of others that I work with, those two aspects of mutual recognition.
Okay, thank you. That's a good place to put a period at it. And before we thank Jack and Leila, as you return home tonight, and this gets on to perhaps a continuation of Leila's last point, I'd like you to consider those in both countries who have no agency, who have lost loved ones, and whose primary desire is to live in a world where their children have a better life than they do. I think that's very important. Our next regular event is going to be on the 15th of February with Lucy Hornby. Our event partner for the evening is the Economic Club of Traverse City. Ms. Hornby is a visiting scholar at Harvard Center for Chinese Studies, and her research focuses on the revival of the Chinese state and the rise of Xi Jinping. Lucy has reported from every Chinese province and region on topics ranging from elite politics to the trade war and environmental pollution, and it's certain to be a fascinating presentation. We hope that the presentation tonight was useful and reflects our purpose to educate both students and citizens of this great part of the globe we live in. And if you are already a member, thank you. If not, it's pretty easy to join through our website, tciaf.com, and before the year's end, or maybe even consider a holiday gift of memberships to that person who is impossible to buy for. Membership is what makes IAF possible. At this point, I'm going to wish you all a good night, and until the next time, be well and be safe and go forth and do great things. And now join me in welcoming or thanking both Jack and Leila for taking this on. Thank you.